After Christmas, I found a $2,300 charge on my card. Dad grinned and declared, "Since you don't have kids, you should help those who do." I laughed once and then announced, "Great. Then you'll love what comes next." That night, I canceled every payment, froze the family card, and reported the loan in my name. By morning, the power was cut, the mortgage was flagged, and my phone had 25 missed calls begging me to reconsider. I, 32M, always thought being the responsible one in the family meant something. Turns out, it just made me the perfect target. The discovery happened on December 27th, when I was reviewing my credit card statement over coffee. There it was, bold as brass, $2,300 charged to premium electronics and gaming. I nearly choked on my drink. I hadn't bought anything close to that amount, and certainly nothing gaming-related. My first instinct was fraud. Someone had stolen my card information. But as I dug deeper into the transaction details, the billing address made my blood run cold. It was my childhood home, Dad's house. I drove over immediately, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each mile. When I arrived, the scene in the living room told me everything I needed to know. My nephew was sprawling across a brand-new leather gaming chair, playing on what looked like the latest PlayStation setup. The 65-inch TV mounted on the wall still had the price sticker partially visible. Dad looked up from his newspaper as I walked in, and I could see the guilt flash across his face for just a moment before he composed himself. I asked him directly about the charges, and that's when his expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, defiance mixed with entitlement. He set down his paper and looked me straight in the eye. Then he told me that since I didn't have kids of my own, I should be helping those who do. He said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, like he was explaining basic math to a child. I felt something crack inside my chest. Here was my father, the man who raised me to value honesty and hard work, justifying stealing from me because I'd chosen not to have children. The audacity was breathtaking. My sister emerged from the kitchen at that moment, and I could tell from her expression that she'd been in on it. She started explaining how tight money had been since her divorce, how her son deserved to have nice things for Christmas just like other kids. She painted this picture of noble sacrifice, as if using my stolen credit card information was some kind of family charity. I looked around the room again. The gaming setup wasn't the only new addition. There were expensive shopping bags by the door, new clothes scattered around, and what looked like a tablet still in its packaging on the coffee table. This wasn't just about making one kid happy. This was a full-blown shopping spree funded by my financial responsibility. Dad leaned back in his chair and told me I was being selfish. He reminded me that I had a good job, no dependents, and plenty of disposable income. He said family was supposed to look out for each other, and this was just me doing my part. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. The absurdity of the situation hit me all at once. They'd literally stolen from me and were now lecturing me about family values. That's when I told them they were going to love what came next. The drive home was a blur. My mind was racing, but for the first time in hours, I felt clear about what needed to happen. They wanted to treat me like a personal ATM? Fine. But ATMs can be shut down. I spent that evening at my kitchen table with my laptop, a notepad, and every financial document I could find. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd initially thought. Over the past 3 years, I'd been gradually taking on more and more of my father's financial obligations. It started innocently enough. When Dad retired early due to health issues, I'd offered to help with some bills temporarily. That temporary help had morphed into me covering his mortgage payments, car insurance, health insurance premiums, and even the family cell phone plan. My sister had been added to my credit cards for emergencies, which apparently now included Christmas shopping sprees. I'd been so focused on being the good son, the reliable one, that I hadn't noticed how completely they'd integrated my income into their lifestyle. They weren't just stealing from me occasionally, they were systematically draining me. The loan Dad mentioned was particularly infuriating. Somehow, he'd managed to take out a personal loan using me as a co-signer without my knowledge. The paperwork had been forged, but convincingly enough that the bank had approved it. That money had funded my sister's car down payment 6 months ago. By midnight, I had a complete action plan. Every automatic payment, every shared account, every financial connection between us was going to be severed. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger's bank account, I'd treat them like strangers. The first step was calling my credit card companies. I reported the fraudulent charges and had new cards expedited. Then I contacted the bank about the forged loan documents. The customer service representative was surprisingly helpful once I explained the situation and provided documentation showing I'd never signed the paperwork. Next came the utilities. Dad's house was in his name, but I'd been paying the bills for 2 years. I called each company and removed my payment authorization effective immediately. The same went for the internet, cable, and security system. The mortgage was trickier, but I'd been making those payments through automatic withdrawal from my checking account. I called the bank and stopped all future payments, then filed a complaint about the fraudulent loan that was apparently secured against the house without my knowledge. By 3 a.m., I was exhausted but not finished. I'd frozen every shared credit card, canceled the family cell phone plan, and even removed my sister's authorized user status from accounts she'd had access to for years. The final step was changing all my passwords and security questions. They'd obviously had access to my financial information somehow, and I wasn't taking any chances. I fell asleep around 4 a.m., more emotionally drained than I'd ever been. But there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own finances. My phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. Dad's number. I let it go to voicemail. Then my sister called. Then Dad again. By 7:30, I had 12 missed calls and counting. I made coffee and listened to the voicemails while watching the sunrise through my kitchen window. The progression was fascinating. The first message from Dad was confused. Apparently the power had been shut off without warning. The second was annoyed. Why hadn't the utility company sent a notice? By the fifth message, panic was setting in. The mortgage company had called about missed payments and the fraudulent loan situation. The sixth message was from my sister, frantically asking why her credit card wasn't working. The calls kept coming throughout the morning. Each voicemail was more desperate than the last. They'd apparently tried to use my credit cards for groceries and been declined. The car insurance had lapsed. The cell phone service was suspended. Around 10 a.m., my sister showed up at my apartment. I watched through the window as she banged on my door for 15 minutes before finally leaving. She called immediately after, and this time I answered. She was crying, asking what was wrong with me, why I was being so cruel. She said her son was scared because the power was off and the house was getting cold. She begged me to fix whatever I'd done. I told her I hadn't done anything cruel. I'd simply stopped paying for things that weren't mine. I explained that if she wanted electricity, she needed to pay the electric bill. If she wanted credit cards, she needed to apply for her own. She screamed at me then, saying I was destroying the family over money. She called me selfish and heartless. She said I'd never understand what it was like to have real responsibilities. That's when I reminded her that she was talking to someone she'd stolen $2,300 from less than 24 hours earlier. I told her that if she wanted to discuss family values and responsibilities, we could start with her explaining how stealing from family members fit into that philosophy. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then she hung up. Dad called an hour later. His approach was different. He was trying to be reasonable, asking if we could work something out. He acknowledged that maybe they should have asked before making the Christmas purchases, but he insisted they'd fully intended to pay me back. I asked him about the forged loan documents. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he admitted that he'd been desperate and hadn't thought it through properly. He said he'd make it right somehow. I told him he could make it right by dealing with his own financial obligations like an adult. I explained that I was done being his safety net, done being the family bank account, and definitely done being stolen from. He tried to guilt me then, talking about how he'd raised me and sacrificed for me, how family was supposed to stick together through hard times. He painted a picture of me as ungrateful and cold-hearted. I listened patiently, then asked him if he remembered teaching me about honesty when I was a kid. I reminded him of the time he made me return a candy bar I'd taken from a store when I was 8, how he'd explained that taking things that didn't belong to you was wrong, regardless of whether you could afford it or thought you deserved it. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. By afternoon, the calls had multiplied. Apparently, the mortgage situation was more serious than I'd realized. The fraudulent loan had triggered a review of the entire account, and the bank was threatening foreclosure proceedings. Without my payments, Dad was 3 months behind, and the forged documents had flagged the account for investigation. My sister called again, this time with a different strategy. She apologized profusely, promising to pay back every penny. She said she'd get a second job, sell things, whatever it took. She just needed me to restore the payments temporarily while she figured out a long-term solution. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the look on her face when I discovered the charges. Not guilty, not apologetic, but annoyed that I'd found out. I told her that her financial problems weren't my responsibility to solve. I suggested she contact social services if she needed help with utilities, look into payment assistance programs, or consider moving somewhere more affordable. I gave her practical advice, the same advice I'd give any stranger in her situation. She called me heartless again and hung up. Update 1. 3 days later, reality had fully set in for them. Dad called with a completely different tone, defeated, desperate. The mortgage company had scheduled a foreclosure hearing. The utility companies required full payment plus deposits to restore service. His car insurance had been canceled, meaning he couldn't legally drive. Most importantly, the bank was pursuing criminal charges for the forged loan documents. Apparently, falsifying loan applications is taken quite seriously, and they'd found security footage of him signing my name. He begged me to call the bank, to tell them it was a misunderstanding, that I'd given him permission. I told him I wouldn't lie to cover up his crimes. I suggested he contact a lawyer instead of me. My sister's situation was equally dire. Without my credit cards, she couldn't afford groceries. The power company wanted $800 upfront to restore service. Her son was staying with friends while she figured out basic necessities. She'd tried to get her own credit cards, but her credit score was apparently worse than I'd known. Years of late payments and defaults had destroyed her creditworthiness. She'd been relying on my accounts without me realizing the extent of her financial irresponsibility. The family was painting me as the villain, of course. Extended relatives were calling, asking why I was being so harsh. Cousins were reaching out on social media, sharing sob stories about Dad losing his house and my sister struggling with her son. I started responding to these messages with simple facts. I'd explained that I discovered $2,300 in fraudulent charges, that loan documents had been forged in my name, and that I'd been unknowingly subsidizing 2 households for years. The tone of these conversations changed quickly once people understood what had actually happened. Some family members were shocked. They had no idea about the financial manipulation. A few even apologized for initially judging me. Others went silent, probably reconsidering their own financial relationships with Dad and my sister. Update 2. A week after the initial confrontation, Dad showed up at my workplace. He looked terrible, unshaven, wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in days earlier. He waited in the parking lot until I got off work, then approached me as I walked to my car. He tried a new approach this time. Instead of anger or guilt, he went with complete submission. He acknowledged everything he'd done wrong, admitted the stealing, the lying, the manipulation. He said he'd been a terrible father and he understood why I was angry. But then he asked me to think about my nephew. He painted a picture of an innocent kid suffering for adult mistakes, sleeping in a cold house, eating peanut butter sandwiches for every meal. He asked if my pride was worth a child's well-being. I had to admire the strategy. It was manipulative but effective. For a moment, I almost wavered. Then I remembered that this child had a mother who chose to spend stolen money on video games instead of paying bills. I remembered that his grandfather had forged documents and committed fraud instead of living within his means. I reminded Dad that the child's suffering was a direct result of his family's choices, not mine. I told him that if he was truly concerned about his grandson's welfare, he should be talking to social services, not me. I suggested he focus on legal ways to solve his problems instead of trying to manipulate me into funding his lifestyle again. He broke down then, actually crying in the parking lot. He said he didn't know how to fix any of this, that he'd made too many mistakes and couldn't see a way forward. He admitted that he'd gotten used to having me solve all his problems and didn't know how to be responsible for himself anymore. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. For a brief moment, I saw my father as he really was, not the strong, reliable man I'd idolized as a child, but a scared, financially incompetent person who'd been using me as a crutch for years. I felt sorry for him, but I didn't change my mind. Instead, I gave him the number for a financial counseling service and suggested he start there. I told him that fixing his problems would require him to actually face them, not find new ways to avoid responsibility. Update 3. 2 weeks later, my sister lost the house. Dad couldn't make the mortgage payments, and the foreclosure proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. The fraudulent loan situation had complicated everything, making it impossible to negotiate payment plans or modifications. They both ended up moving in with our cousin temporarily. My nephew was enrolled in a new school district. Dad's car was repossessed, forcing him to rely on public transportation. The criminal charges were still pending. Dad's lawyer was pushing for a plea deal, but the bank seemed determined to make an example of the case. Apparently, loan fraud had been increasing, and they wanted to send a message. My sister found a job at a grocery store, minimum wage, but it was something. She'd also applied for various assistance programs and was slowly learning to live within her actual means. The family dynamics had shifted completely. Extended relatives who'd initially criticized me were now avoiding both Dad and my sister. The full extent of their financial irresponsibility had become public knowledge, and people were reevaluating their own relationships with them. Some family members started reaching out to me, not to criticize, but to share their own stories. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been taken advantage of. Dad had borrowed money from several relatives over the years, always with promises to pay back that never materialized. My sister had similar patterns with friends and extended family. I realized that my situation wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of financial manipulation that had been going on for years. By cutting them off, I'd inadvertently exposed the entire system. 3 months later, Dad took the plea deal. He received probation and was ordered to pay restitution, though everyone knew he'd never be able to afford the full amount. The conviction meant he'd never be able to get legitimate loans again, which was probably for the best. My sister was slowly rebuilding her life. The minimum wage job had led to a promotion, and she'd managed to save enough for a security deposit on a small apartment. More importantly, she'd enrolled in financial literacy classes and seemed to be genuinely learning from her mistakes. My nephew adjusted to the new circumstances better than anyone expected. The gaming setup was long gone, sold to help pay bills, but he seemed happier overall. The constant financial stress in the household had lifted, replaced by a more stable, if modest, lifestyle. As for me, I felt lighter than I had in years. My bank account was my own again. My credit score had actually improved once the fraudulent accounts were removed. Most importantly, I'd learned to set boundaries and stick to them. The family relationships were permanently changed. Dad and I spoke occasionally, but the conversations were surface level. He'd never apologized directly for the theft and manipulation, just for getting caught. My sister and I had found a middle ground. We could be civil at family gatherings, but the trust was gone. Looking back, I realized that my revenge hadn't been planned as revenge at all. It had simply been me taking back control of my own life. The consequences for Dad and my sister were the natural result of their choices, not my vindictiveness. They'd gambled that I'd always be there to bail them out, that family loyalty would override basic self-respect. They'd lost that bet completely. Sometimes people ask if I regret how harshly I handled the situation. The answer is no. They'd spent years training me to be their personal safety net, and I'd enabled that behavior by always giving in. Breaking that cycle required dramatic action. The hardest part wasn't cutting off the money. It was accepting that the people I'd trusted most had been systematically using me. But once I faced that reality, everything else became clear. I learned that real family doesn't steal from each other, doesn't forge documents, and doesn't manipulate emotions to avoid consequences. Real family respects boundaries and takes responsibility for their own choices. That Christmas charge taught me more about my family than 30 years of holidays ever had. And while the lesson was painful, it was also liberating. I'm finally living my own life, funded by my own work, without subsidizing anyone else's poor choices. It's a good feeling.